Hello and welcome to our Syxsense May Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after. And with that, Rob Brown.
Thanks very much, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everyone for the May Patch Tuesday webinar. But over the next 30 minutes, we're going to advise you on some pretty credible vulnerabilities you should be targeting as a priority this month, and a few other things that we think you should keep your eyes on in case something later on this month, things actually start to change. More on that in a second. I'll also include a few techniques that we've been using and sort of adapting and evolving over the last decade to help us deploy over 100 million patches to our customers worldwide. So everyone's welcome. Thank you. First, we're going to cover some news and one of those things, interesting things I mentioned just in that introduction there. Now, it may be interesting or a surprise to know that there's actually more than one Patch Tuesday each month. In fact, the first, second, and third Tuesday of each month, there is actually a different release, believe it or not, from Microsoft. The first of those Patch Tuesdays are reserved for .NET Framework, the second for security, and the third actually being previews. Now, what was interesting is that we saw last month, so this was actually at the end of last month, we actually did see quite a few preview updates released for .NET Framework, and those preview releases are almost a bite-sized test of a patch that might get released publicly the following month. And obviously they are tested and they kind of explore any negative impacts that those patches have to the system, and then they fix those prior to the official release. Now, we did have some previews last month, but we've had no .NET Framework updates at all released yesterday. This can mean a couple of things. One, the testing didn't complete and they were not happy with the release, or maybe the updates aren't serious enough and they're just going to roll them into the next month. Either way, this is surprising. And it's kind of the first time we've seen it this year. So IT managers should keep an eye out because there could be an out of band update for June where Microsoft in a couple of days release the updates they would have released yesterday. So please be aware that could be on the horizon this month. We also had Google Chrome. So Google Chrome released another version, 1.13. It fixed 15 security updates, but nothing, pleased to say, nothing was weaponized in that release. But if you are patching your environment, Google Chrome is essential that it is included in your rollout. And in fact, if it is a tool that you use in your organization, then Google Chrome should automatically be included, even if there aren't any weaponized updates being fixed. Microsoft also announced, which was really interesting, for Windows 10, 22H2 is the last feature update they're going to release for it. I think they're pushing now Windows 11, and if you followed us on our last webinar, we talked about Windows 12 actually is in the not too distant future, and we've actually seen a few beta versions of that. It looks quite good. But more on the feature update as we hear it from Microsoft. CISA, we do like to follow CISA very carefully because CISA do give us some very useful information about priorities that we should be making. They didn't make one for Google Chrome, but they did make one for Firefox. Firefox 1.13 was released and has several security fixes. That advisory is 2023-16, and Firefox ESR was released. That's 102.11, and that is security advisory 2023-17. Both of those should also be included in any rollout in your environment should you have it. And interesting release. We were not expecting this. In fact, when we were provided uh, the release earlier on this week by Microsoft, as a part of the Microsoft Map program, we do get to see the kinds of updates that are being released, although we're not allowed to release that information publicly. I was very surprised to only see that there are 38 fixes in this Patch Tuesday release. 7 are critical and 31 are important. But although we only had 31 fixes, 7 being critical last month, where we had close to 100, or actually we did have 99 updates, almost 100 fixes, we had 8 of those being critical. So in terms of the importance of this Patch Tuesday, the majority of the fixes are actually more critical than they were last month. And I'll come back on that because we have some more interesting information on how the CVSS scores match up in terms of the total release of fixes. 8 of those are more likely to be weaponized, to be exploited in the wild. 1, in fact, was weaponized. 2 are public aware, and also no jump points. That's very interesting. We haven't had any release this year to date where we didn't have a jump point. Obviously, I'm looking at the patches that we had and whether or not that there's a collaboration between the patches that were released, that were not released, and traditional jump points that exist. Now, just so you know, a jump point is where a vulnerability, if it's exploited, can be used to jump sideways inside the operating system into another technology. So, for example, if you were to, I don't know, breach the kernel, you could jump from kernel memory into an operating system service. You can jump sideways and out of that technology. And if you've followed us for several years, that is actually how the SolarWinds exploit occurred. They went through one vulnerability, moved sideways, left some breadcrumbs, and they were able to exploit over and over again over a long period of time by using that one lower severity vulnerability as an entry point into that network. But luckily for us, in this release, there are no jump points, but we are going to keep an eye on this because jump points, although don't have a direct correlation to the severity of a vulnerability, they do offer this underlying risk that you might have if exploited. So we always like to prioritize a jump point, even if the severity of the vulnerability isn't critical or high. Now we look at the types of bugs that we had fixed, and once again, remote code execution had the highest number of fixes. Remote code execution is a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute commands to place malware or other malicious code on your computer or network. We had 8 of those fixed, followed by elevation of privilege vulnerability, where we had 8 of these fixed. That's a threat actor that gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. Information disclosure vulnerability, that's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. That can happen actually through a memory leak, and those are very serious, especially depending on the type of data that it's able to access, such as passwords. We had 8 of those. Denial of service, we had 5 of those, and that's an attack that's just simply meant to shut down your device or to make it inaccessible. So like a multiple ping on a web server to take the server offline is an example of a denial of service. Feature bypass, we had 4 of those. That's when an attacker bypasses your authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. And lastly, we have a spoofing vulnerability, which is basically acting as a disguise to pretend you're not the person that you intend to be. So let's talk about how we're going to prioritize these 38 vulnerabilities. Now, it's simple to use a severity alone. And actually many customers of ours that on board with Syxsense actually traditionally have done so. They've used a single identifier for the patches that they want to deploy to resolve the vulnerabilities that meet a particular vendor severity. And that's actually not a bad idea. There's just other ways as well to help you be more selective and be more accurate. The vendor severity is issued by them and typically goes from a critical, which is the highest severity, to NA, which is the lowest severity. And it goes critical, medium, or it's important, uh, high, low, and NA. Now, we also like to add an independent score to Syxsense content called the CVSS score. And it's built from a calculator owned by an independent organization run by NIST. And that calculation is able to take the factors that are around not just the vulnerability itself, but how to exploit and how complex it is to exploit. And that calculation actually comes out with a single number out of 10, 10 being the most critical and 0 being the least critical. Actually, anything that is 9 or above is seen as a critical CVSS severity, and anything anything above 7 up until 9 is actually seen as a high severity. More on that in a bit, because there's actually some really interesting data that we've seen in this release concerning that. Now, if you put the two together, you do get somewhat of a balanced approach to the severity of a vulnerability. You could say if it's critical or high on the vendor, or it's critical or high on the CVSS, you ought to select it for your patch deployment. And especially customers or those of you that are joining us today that aren't using Syxsense, you may be using other Microsoft tools, and you may be familiar with rings of severity of content. You'll obviously be using rings of content, so you'll be sending out your critical ones first, your highs or important second, before you move down medium, low, and NA. If you do put the two together, you get somewhat of a better idea about the severity, and we believe that being able to select more than one severity gives you a much better detail of how much risk you may have. And obviously it helps you to see the nuances of vendors that do issue sometimes surprising severities when the independent CVSS score is much, much higher. In that case, in that example, Google Chrome at the beginning of last month, 1 week after Patch Tuesday, they released a weaponized vulnerability, a weaponized update for Google Chrome, but they gave it an NA severity, but the CVSS score was much higher. So just to give you an example of where a vendor sometimes can measure their vulnerability from a severity perspective a bit different to the independent score. Now you've got the state of the vulnerabilities. Now you know the severity, now you need the state of the vulnerability. Now we call these weaponized vulnerabilities where it's being actively exploited. And we work closely with our antivirus partners and with Microsoft to collect the evidence to help us know that these particular vulnerabilities are being actively used in an exploit. And in fact, the antivirus organizations around the world are actually working together to pass that data across to Microsoft and other third-party vendors, letting them know when a particular exploit came in via one of these bugs. And then the vendors obviously produce fixes for those, and that data gets collected and stored, and we're able to tap into that. Now, a weaponized vulnerability means it's actively being exploited, and obviously you might say, regardless of the severity, if it's being weaponized somewhere, then you should take a proactive stance to go ahead and resolve it. Public aware, on the other hand, is where it's not quite weaponized, but the precise method to exploit has been made public. Please be aware there are a lot of public aware vulnerabilities that never actually do get exploited. However, it's a clue that should the vulnerability be easily exploitable, then this data can be used to actually find out how to hack one of these particular updates. It comes via bug bounty programs and white hat hackers that are continually searching for ways to break into an operating system, and they genuinely are trying to do that to help the security of that operating system and software. They let the vendor know, the vendor makes a decision, and they go ahead and produce a patch for it. I wouldn't want to be an IT manager that knew something was public aware, but I didn't deploy the patch for it because I didn't feel like it was going to be exploited. So again, just proactive states help us to be able to react it quickly when a vulnerability isn't yet being weaponized, but could be. Public aware is our sort of early warning sign, as you might say. Now, to balance these, we've got countermeasures. Now, countermeasures exist where the vendor has released a mitigation or a workaround. Mitigation meaning that maybe you've got a highly sophisticated antivirus, or maybe only a certain version of the software exists that can be exploited. In those scenarios, obviously, they are mitigations and you may not need to worry about it. You've always got workarounds. Workarounds can exist where you will apply registry keys or group policy changes. Those can actually effectively mitigate the vulnerability, and you don't need to deploy such a large payload across your environment. Going back to some of the other vendors that are available, some very, very good vendors available, but some of them aren't able to deploy large amounts of data over large distances without local distribution points, or they require an awful lot of network. In that scenario, a countermeasure where you're changing a registry key or maybe switching a security posture on a remote device to secure it is much, much easier to achieve than actually rolling out big updates. Just a caveat on that, if you are deploying countermeasures using Syxsense or any other tools that are available for patching, please keep an eye on the official patch website. If they recommend you remove the workaround, please remove the workaround. Registry keys should not be left on your system if you don't need them there. That has actually been used as an entry point before. So if you are adding in workarounds, please make sure you remove them. Okay, and your exposure. So just because something is weaponized and it's public aware doesn't necessarily mean it's your priority at this point. You have to base it on your exposure. So the data and the analytics of your exposure should really dictate to you which of those you should deploy more urgently than others. And in fact, we are going to give you the list. All you've got to do is take the CVE of the vulnerabilities, pop them into your tool set, and whichever one is most exposed is the patch you should be deploying first using all these 6 factors that we have here today. Just to repeat, just because your exposure is really high on a lower severity vulnerability, if that happens to be weaponized, that's probably the one you should be targeting first. So let's take a look at the analysis of Patch Tuesday. As I said, we didn't have a huge amount of vulnerabilities to talk about, but we do have some very interesting things that I want to cover. So I actually have quite a large team, a brilliant team of security analysts trawling through the Microsoft Patch Tuesday data, and they've actually come up with some really interesting data for us today. If you're familiar with this format, we actually have all of our data popped onto our Syxsense website on Patch Tuesday. So you can actually access this data almost 6 to 10 hours ago, but we'll actually show you where to find that. So if you go to the Syxsense.com website, where you can find out all that we do from a Syxsense product perspective, how we can secure your environment. You come up to the resources section, and we have our resource center. We also have a lot of news that we release on industry specific data and also more importantly, our vulnerability database. We do have a lot of vulnerabilities in here where we are actually teaching customers how to solve them via the resources section. In the resources section, we also have several topics that we know are very interesting, such as zero trust, patch management, but of course, more importantly, the Patch Tuesday, which is why we're all here. All of our Patch Tuesday releases go to this this holding page, and if you want, you can actually subscribe to this. Just go into the corner here, place a message for our team, and they can actually invite you each and every month when we release a new update. Now, within our Patch Tuesday release article that we published, I'm going to cover some very interesting things, as we said right at the start. We have updates for Microsoft Windows, Components, Office, SharePoint, Visual Studio, Sysinternals, and Teams, and that is it. We do not have any updates whatsoever for SQL Server. We do not have any updates whatsoever for .NET Framework. And there's actually quite a few others that we usually get updates for that we haven't this time. Hence why please keep an eye on these releases. When we do see that new content has been released out of band, we always publish them to our resources page. Keep an eye on that resources page. And if it does, please take the advice of the article if you need to prioritize it. Now, of the 38 fixes, we had 2 of them which resolved a CVSS score of 9.0. That was actually the same as it was last month. What's super interesting is that when we count the average score of each of these fixes, they're almost all above 7. There's actually a couple at the bottom there which are lower than 7. But if you take that and compare it to last month, we have an extraordinary high number of very serious vulnerabilities in this list. So although we had much less fixes than we did last month, the fixes we do have are, according to CVSS, far more critical. Actually, from a statistical analysis perspective, we had 722.4 combined CVSS score last month and 275.3 this month. So there is a collaboration between these being far more serious this month. Now, what is also interesting is that we've covered CVE 2023-29336, or the equivalent that has been released that month for the last 5 months in a row. This is a Windows 32 elevation of privilege vulnerability, and this is extremely serious. This is the vulnerability that has been weaponized every single month since January of this year. Now, this is a Windows kernel vulnerability where it fails to properly handle objects in memory. And when we follow the CISA recommendation, they require all federal agencies to patch all systems vulnerable for it within the next couple of weeks. So it's a very serious vulnerability. It is already being weaponized, and whatever is happening, Microsoft are fixing this issue, and it's being re-exploited. So it's clearly not being fixed quick enough permanently. And we do know that the Microsoft antivirus partners are helping Microsoft to identify how these attacks are happening. Now, this is interesting. It has a offender severity of just important, although it has been exploited every single month this year, has a CVSS of 7.8 out of 10, so it's very serious. Actually, this would be more serious if the attack vector wasn't local network specific. So you do have to be on the local network in order to attack, but it does have a low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction. As I mentioned, there's no jump point. Now, the second one, which is actually really interesting, is a Windows OLE vulnerability. Now, OLE, this vulnerability is 2023-29325. Now, OLE is an object linking and embedding proprietary technology built by Microsoft that allows embedding and linking to documents and other objects inside Microsoft files, such as emails. So you may be familiar with adding an attachment or a picture to your email signature. Well, in an attack scenario, an attacker could exploit this vulnerability by sending that crafted email to a victim. Exploitation of the vulnerability might involve either them opening an email or simply displaying it with the preview pane. I know a lot of IT, a lot of retail customers of ours. I know a lot of the customers that we speak to on these webinars use preview panes in Outlook as a way of becoming more efficient with accessing those emails, and also preview pane within Word and Excel as well exists within the Windows file browser. Simply viewing that can actually launch an attack on that device. It has a vendor severity of critical. Its CVSS is 8.1. I actually have and the reason why it's 8.1 is because its attack complexity is rather high. If it was easier to exploit, it would have a much more serious vulnerability CVSS score, probably around 10 or 9.8. It isn't yet weaponized, but it is public aware. It can attack across any network, including the internet, no privileges and no user interaction. So simply opening that email in a preview pane without actually opening the email itself could unfortunately release the code on your PC and you can become a victim. And my third, and I have an honorable mention actually, but my third vulnerability of highlight is CVE 2023-24941. This is a Windows network file system remote code execution vulnerability. Now, the network file system provides a file sharing solution, lets you transfer files, of course, from one device to another, say Windows to Windows, but also Windows to Linux or Windows to Unix. So if you have Unix and Linux in your environment, this does need to be patched. This is more likely to be exploited as advised by Microsoft. It has a vendor severity of critical. It is carrying a CVSS score of 9.8. Now, it can be attacked over any network, including the internet. It does have a high attack complexity, but no privileges, not just low privileges, but no privileges whatsoever, and no user interaction. That is a very, very serious vulnerability to be patching if you have Windows servers in your environment, especially if you have Windows servers access those Linux and Unix operating systems. Now, lastly, every vulnerability I mentioned is listed down here. We have all of the factors that help us to prioritize those from most urgent to least urgent. Take the CVE from here, pop it into your tool set, and whichever one of these you have most detected in your environment should be deployed urgently. My honorable mention is this one, CVE 2023-24932. This is a secure boot security feature bypass vulnerability. It is the third on the list. It is also public aware, but it is requiring a specific scenario to occur. So the secure boot does need to be enabled. This has been found by a boot kit called Black Lotus, and actually it has been exploited already this year. So if you've got Unified Extensible Firmware Interface or UEFI at your secure boot, then this is one that you will want to urgently deploy to your devices. The exploitation is less likely. That's why I've made this as my honorable mention instead of the Windows Network File System vulnerability, which has a much higher CVSS score. So if you do have secure boot protection turned on, then this one is definitely recommended that you include in your deployment. If you need any assistance from a testing perspective or a patching strategy, or if you would like just to see how we do things at Syxsense, you'd like to schedule a quick 30-minute demo to see our product in action, please use the link up there in the corner. And I hope that what we've covered today has helped you to be more able to secure your environment going forward. And until the next month, I wish you happy patching.